You are now listening to the Friends of Rugby Podcast. Relax your anus. Balls. Thick thighs. Camille Shat. Where's his neck? Eddie Jones. You're fucked, mate. We're nice now. Hello, friends. You are listening to the Friends of Rugby Podcast. Frank has still abandoned the podcast. He's gone for another 2 weeks. So I'm here with a very special guest. Stu from Rouge Rugby Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming on the show. Yeah, I was looking for guests while Frank was gone and reaching out to people, and I was fortunate enough for you to say yes. So let's people know a little bit about Stu. Who is Stu from the Rouge Rugby Podcast?
Well, I am a British Canadian. I have lived in Toronto since 2018, became a citizen at the start of this year. I have English and Welsh parents, so rugby has always been pretty big in our family. I played it when I was in high school, and then I wasn't ever good enough to be on like a professional outfit, and I knew that from the start, but I knew like the social aspect of it. Played at my university halls team in my first year. I played in a German club when I worked in Austria for a year, and then I stepped aside, and the real world came along, and I had to get a real job and couldn't pick up all the bruises that I used to, and couldn't take all the time off to allow things to heal. So I stepped away from the game. When I came to Toronto, I think that weekend, I went to my first rugby game in Canada, which was the Ontario Arrows playing the Glendale Raptors in a 2018 preseason or postseason exhibition season fixture, and the Ontario Arrows smashed it. And then a few months later, the Toronto Arrows were introduced as the rebranding of the Ontario Arrows. They were my team when 2020 came along, and all that fun stuff that we're all trying to repress. I was approached by the guys at Rouge Rugby to come on as a co-host. So Dan and Derek reached out to me, and I've been with the podcast ever since. And
how did that interaction happen? How did that come about? How did you guys meet?
So I knew of Derek because he did, at the time, I think it was like the Last Word on Sports. And I'd met Dan a few times at Arrows games. And I think the last time we all saw each other in person was the 2020 preseason launch for the Arrows that was held in Toronto. And then it was just a conversation. It just ended up being a message on I think like Facebook Messenger or something, just from Dan asking if I wanted to be on the podcast. And I said, yeah, sure. And I thought it was just as, like a guest coming along as like, oh, you're a fan of the Arrows, come talk for a bit. And then it emerged that they wanted me to be one of the co-hosts. And then when Dan had to step down because of the birth of his second child, he was the host. He was the one who was like guiding the conversation. When he stepped down, I took on that role. And then Derek and I have just been, making moves with the podcast ever since. We've introduced, our focus, as we say, is like we focus on real Canadian rugby, which is also the motto from the dearly departed Bill Webb. So we have
I would like to talk about him later too.
Yeah, no problem. But we've interviewed some like amazing, like people I never thought that I would ever get the chance to interview, like DTH Van der Merwe, Jess Hassler, Karen Pakwi, Olympians, guys that have been to the Rugby World Cups, and getting their opinions and stuff. And it's just been absolutely fantastic. Obviously, with the end of the Arrows, focus on MLR has obviously waned this season. But we're still keeping interest of like, oh, these Canadian guys are still in these teams, so keep an eye out for them, so on and so forth. And we obviously knew that coming into this year, but we're trying to pick it up. We know that there's lots of interviews that we want to do for the remainder of this year. Obviously, it depends on player availability and coaching availability as well, because we know that there's some people that we want to interview, but their focus is the Olympics or the WXV or like the Pacific Nations Cup coming up. So obviously, we can't really interfere in that. And most people have been fantastically supportive. Everyone involved in the Arrows was incredibly receptive of what we've done, and now those players are now playing in other MLR teams. We've been reaching out, and I understand, it's a professional athlete. That's their job first and foremost, and some people can't respond to us, and we fully understand that. But those that do respond, whether it's to say, "Oh, sorry, I'm busy," or "Yeah, I'd love to talk," is like, it's just great. We just want to get the word out about Canadian rugby as best as we can.
I think you guys do a really, really good job at that. You opened up a can of worms in that opening speech there. I got to catch up here. First of all, what position did you play back home?
It was hooker or prop again, because I wasn't good. Is that it wasn't really like specialized. And then when I played in Austria, I played fullback. But my weight hadn't changed at all. I just gone from the biggest guy to one of the smaller guys that had turned up, just because their actual front row were monsters. They were like a good foot taller than me, a few inches wider, but it's like they were the brick wall, and I just had to like avoid them in training. And unfortunately, because of where the team was located and the league we were in, it was basically that the other German teams were so far away because they were in Munich and we were on the border between Austria and Germany, that other teams refused to make the trek to come and play us. But as a result, we would then get a bonus point victory automatically. I think it was something like 50-0 was the registered score. So when we played the other teams, we at their location, we would more often than not lose, because it would be a game of 15 and we would only have like 16 players. Everyone was exhausted by the 60th minute, and but they never made a return leg, so never got relegated. So it all worked out.
Just got the buys all the way to the top, made it to the playoffs, and
all the way to the middle. Yeah.
What was surprising about Austrian rugby? Like, was there anything that like really shook you? Was there any kind of rugby culture shock?
I think it was going into it. I didn't expect first of all, I didn't expect a German rugby culture. But from what I found out, a lot of the guys that played would be in the situation of, so for example, the reason why I was in Austria to begin with is because I was working for Red Bull at the time, and they were based in Salzburg, which is on the border of Germany. So there would be a lot of English guys. I think there was a couple of Americans who, couldn't play American football, and this was the closest thing. So they were involved. We had a few Europeans. Like I had a Spanish player that I would, he would drive in and I would cycle to his, so I could get to the ground. And yeah, so and our opposition also featured a lot of university students who were doing like a year abroad in Germany, and they would they would just join a team and play while they were out there. And the second thing, and this was like my first experience of how the weather affects the rugby season is that it would play September till November, and then April until like June, because the ground would be frozen for winter. So you obviously couldn't play during that time. And we did do some training sessions in the snow, and maybe in hindsight that probably wasn't like the smartest thing to do, but it was a great time, and I really enjoyed myself out there.
So you played in a team in Austria, but you were playing in a German league?
Yeah.
Is that how it went? Because you were just so close to the border?
Yeah, so the team itself was German, but most of the players were living and working in Austria. It was, the way I put it is, the pitch was in Germany and the car park was in Austria. That's how close to the border it was.
Yeah, because you don't really think of Germany having much of like a rugby community when you think about it. But I guess you don't really think of Canada like that either until you kind of get here and notice that there's a lot of people that want to play, that are interested in it. And so is that like the first? Because like I think one of the best things to do if you move abroad, join a rugby team.
Yeah,
you just meet a whole swath of friends.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that.
Sorry, I'm just gonna keep asking a couple questions about things you say. You said so you had English and Welsh parents.
Yeah.
And did you grow up in Wales?
No, so I grew up in England. I grew up near Birmingham, and so Birmingham, as a city itself, doesn't have a big rugby culture. It is mainly football with Birmingham FC, Aston Villa, and all that stuff. And then the summer sport is cricket. As Edgbaston Cricket Ground. But that said, there is like Birmingham and Solihull Rugby Club as well.
Where's the closest Prem team?
The closest Prem team was the Worcester Warriors. Now it is probably like either Saints or Tigers, I'd say, depending on like which way you go. My geographical knowledge is maybe a bit out of date, and I'm sure someone will be like swearing at the screen of which one is actually the closest club now. But as I said, Welsh, my mum. So me, my brother and sister, we all support Wales at like a national level. And I think that's just because it was like, all right, I'll support England at football, I'll support Wales at rugby, and like appease the parents in that regard. So when I really got into rugby was about 2003. So like the World Cup in Australia, with England going all the way for that one. And then it was like the Six Nations. And of course, this was around the time that, rugby was moving on to like private channels. So like it would be on Sky or things like that. And so it was like much harder to be able to watch rugby, but there was always the Six Nations. That was always on like free TV. And then in 2005, when Wales won the Grand Slam and it had come out of seemingly nowhere, like just hitched me to that bandwagon. And I've been a Wales fan ever since.
Been a diehard ever since. How many times do you watch them play in person?
In person, I have seen them play. I saw a few games at the Rugby World Cup, and one of them was Wales Uruguay, and the other one was Wales Fiji back in 2015. So at least twice. But like anyone who knows is that if you want a ticket to the Six Nations, you're going to have to be signing a new mortgage trying to get those tickets.
You have to have an like a rocket science degree. Like you have to have like I've been looking at it because next year I was wanting to go for my birthday, the Six Nations game, and trying to figure out how to get these tickets is insane. Like it's easier to get World Cup tickets. You just sign up, you're in a draw, and you get tickets. But these Six Nations tickets, you have to be part. I don't know. You have to be part of the Illuminati or something. I
think they have a like remit of you have to give a certain number to clubs in. I know this is for like the RFU is like you have to give a certain number to clubs in England, a certain number get allocated for sponsors and all that stuff, and then the rest is general sale, and then those are like gone in a few minutes. But Depending on when you go, I'd say if any game is in Italy, try and go for one of the Italian games because it's usually a bit cheaper and it's a good like city break as well.
Yeah, that's what people have been telling me. Because I've been messaging online to people that I know, and they're like, "Oh, go to Italy, go to Italy." I'm like, well, I don't want to go to Italy. I want to go to Millennium. I want to go to Aviva. I want to go to what's the one in Scotland there? Murrayfield. Yeah, I want to go to Murrayfield. I don't want to go to where do they play in Italy? Do you know the stadium they're home?
Stadio Olimpico, I think. But yeah. But that's the thing. Well, that's the thing. France normally play at the Stade de France, but because of the Olympics, they didn't this year. And I think but I know that Italy and France have played different locations in the past. But then again, it's just going for like not just the rugby; it's going for like the nightlife, the atmosphere as well. Now, obviously, I'd say even if you don't get a ticket to go to like the Millennium Stadium for any of the Wales games, if you go to one of the pubs, you'd have a perfectly great atmosphere, and the drinks are probably cheaper as well. So works out pretty well.
Yeah, I know. I was expecting when I went to France for the World Cup, I was expecting cheap drinks at the games, but they were not cheap at all.
No, they are not.
And the smoking in France too during the games, and in the games that kind of shocked me too. They're just smoking anywhere. The French will smoke anywhere. I was like, God bless these people. Another question that I wanted to ask you also was what's the history of the Rouge Rugby Podcast?
Well, I can only really know the history from when I joined, but according to like Dan and Derek, from what they've told me, is that the idea came about, I think, like just before the 2019 World Cup in Japan. And it was both of them realized that no one was really talking about the tournament from like any of their sports outlets that they were watching or reading and stuff. And so they were like, hey, let's do a podcast. Let's do it on Canadian rugby. And, we've got a team in MLR with the Toronto Arrows, so we can talk about them. And then, and then the rest just fell from there. So
they had been going on for a while. Because I remember, before the World Cup, listening to the Rouge Rugby Podcast. So they've been going on for a few years now. So it must have started 2017, 2018?
No, 2019. So it'll be the Rouge Rugby's 5th year this year.
How many episodes now?
So we have today, I think we posted our 207th episode.
Wow. That's quite a feat. And then when you started having guests on your podcast, was there any kind of guests that like really surprised you by how engaging they were, friendly they were, or you got any gossip on that? You got any memorable guests on the podcast?
I think that for the most of it, I think when guests come on there, even though we like break down and say like, look, we pre-record, so we edit it. So if there's anything you want to say again, by all means. I think at the start, because we're asking them questions about how they got into rugby and, who was their inspirations and stuff like that. I think everyone like is a bit nervous going on because, you're talking about yourself, you're talking about your teammates and stuff like that. But a lot of guys and women that we've had on have, once the episode gets going, you can hear like they get a bit looser, they get a bit more relaxed, and they get more open and willing to talk. One that sticks out for me personally is that we plan to interview Jeff Hassler, and because he was only available because I think he was based in Austin at this time. So obviously there was like time differences. And the plan was, okay, we're going to interview him Sunday morning. And then once we've done that episode, we'll do another like general news episode. So when the interview finished and we thought, oh, Jeff, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. we then said, oh, we're going to stick around and we'll just do a news episode, because this is what we'd done in the past. We'd interview someone and then we'd, do another episode recording. And Jeff was like, I can stick around if you want. And so if you go through our episode logs, there's an interview with Jeff Hassler, and then there's another episode where we're just talking, and Jeff Hassler's there with us, and
just wants to chat.
Yeah, he was a great spot. I think it just worked out for like everyone involved, just because of when we were doing it and his availability, and so I really appreciate that. But everyone we've had on, we've always been like incredibly grateful. Everyone's been very like flexible and understanding. There hasn't been like any ego or anything off anyone. No one's been like, I can only do this and I'm only going to talk about that. We've been, very open, and we've like issued questions to our guests in advance. And some things they will say, look, I'll talk about this, but I can't talk about that for a number of reasons that they won't get into. And we're like, yep, that's fine. We'll just explain. We'll just like mention it in passing. You don't have to answer it. It's just so like, because if we don't talk about it, someone else is going to ask us, why didn't you talk about it? So, but it's like, we fully understand that, we're asking them for their time, and, we're very grateful for it. So we're very receptive of that. We're very, blessed with the time that we have been given. And yeah, we understand it's like, if we were like more successful, and if we were like, raking in the money, it's like, we're not Steve Nangle or anything like that. We're not like our own podcasting network to then interview people and then pay them for their time. Everyone's just been like really, really graceful and really thankful for the time that they have. So, we take it easily and very grateful for everything going on.
Has any like organizations or like broadcast organizations ever reached out to you guys for content or anything?
Unfortunately, not yet. So, we'll keep trying. We're, always looking to keep growing, but we're also realistic. We know that rugby is a niche sport in Canada. It only really comes up for the Olympics coming up later this year when talking about sevens. And by the time any interest has come about for that, the tournament's over, because it's only, I think like 6 days total for the men's and women's. And then the men's World Cup, that obviously always gets like eyes on the product. The women's World Cup, unfortunately, not to the same extent, although that is mainly down to history. Obviously now World Rugby is putting far more effort into promoting the tournament. The only downside is the most recent tournament was held in New Zealand, so kickoff times were very unfavorable for a lot of North America. So when the next World Cup comes around in 2025, that'll be in England. So kickoff times should be more reasonable. Better. And So in next year's time, when that tournament takes place, and I think like we can definitely try and do a lot more with that.
What about when the Arrows are still around? What was your guys' relationship like with them?
Fantastic. Like we had, I had season tickets because obviously I bought them before I became a member of the Rouge, but we also got media passes. Brock, the media relations guy, was always available for us, always able to give us a moment. A lot of the players, after the games would be, would be available for a quick chat just to say like how the game had been, what it worked out. And especially in 2022, after, the season in Atlanta in 2021, no season in 2020. I feel like a lot of the guys were like much more relaxed and able to like have a chat with us after the game. And we understood our position was like press, and we would only be able to have time with anyone if they were available. But a lot of the times guys from both teams actually would be available for a chat. I know there's a player for San Diego Legion. I don't think he's playing this year. Michael Smith. He's currently studying his doctorate at UBC, but we had him on, I think, in the off season of 22, and then when San Diego came to play in Toronto, he was there, and he would always be eager for a chat. So yeah, but any Canadian player from both sides, I think the word had gotten out by that point. So yeah, we really appreciated any time the players were available and hopefully not injured, so that we could have a chat with them.
Yeah, because the Arrows were surprisingly very, how can I put this in words? They were very like open, very accessible.
Yes.
To their fans, or for a professional sports organization. Like they were very like you could reach out to them and they would respond to you, especially even their owner Bill Webb.
Yeah, no, Bill was
was just always. I remember my interaction with Bill Webb. If I can go back when the Toronto Arrows first started and they had a Facebook fan page.
Yeah.
I joined the Facebook fan page, and there was Bill on the fan page. He was in the fan page, so you would never see anything like that. Also, I get this friend request on Facebook from Bill Webb.
Yeah.
So I have no idea who he is. I just think he's just an Arrows fan, rugby fan.
Yeah.
And so, like, living in Canada and being a rugby fan, you're pretty much living on the moon. So anyone that's going to give attention to rugby, you're going to talk. So I remember chatting with him about games in Europe and all sorts of stuff on Facebook, like chat, messaging him always messaging me back. And I'm just thinking he's just some guy. Like just some. And then one day on YouTube, I'm watching YouTube, and there he is on YouTube. And I'm like, what the hell? Like this guy the whole time? Like that's how, to me, losing Bill Webb, Canada lost like a rugby advocate that we're not going to see for a really long time.
Yeah, we said that when Bill tragically passed, rugby and Canadian rugby had lost a giant because, he was a money guy, and when you get down to the brass tacks, is like you see people saying that, I'd love an MLR team in Vancouver, I'd love an MLR team in Alberta, in Calgary, or let's have one in Winnipeg. Let's have one in Montreal and stuff. Well, bottom line is someone's got to stump up the cash to do it. And Bill was the guy who did that. And when he passed, when we did our memorial episode for him, we reached out to the rugby community and said, hey, if you have any like personal stories of Bill Webb and how he's helped your rugby team or rugby journey, let us know and we'll mention it. And like if you want to leave your name, by all means. If you want to leave it anonymous, that's fine. And I think it was the Toronto Amazons were they still are a women's rugby team in Toronto, and basically it just came down to Bill saying, what do you need? And as a result, there have been players from the Toronto Amazons that have been able to get onto like national honors, whether it's at age grade or at like the senior team as a result. And, their financial position is a lot better. Likewise, TIRF, Toronto Inner City Rugby Foundation, Bill was a huge help in that as well. And when he passed, and you see all these organizations just share their grief and their stories of how important Bill was, it's a real testament to the man. And because I remember his funeral was on September the 9th. And I only remember that because September the 8th, there was a memorial gathering. And not only was that the opening of the 2023 World Cup, but that was also my birthday as well. So, maybe not the happiest birthday to send your respects to someone you care about that's departed. But I felt it was like I had to just go there, just pay my respects, meet the family. And yeah, when I went, it was towards the end of the occasion, but the family was still there. A lot of people involved in Rugby Ontario and the Arrows were there as well. And then obviously, as the months went by and the news, the Arrows were folding, it was really heartbreaking. But, people say like, oh, can we get the Arrows back? And it's like, well, technically they've filed bankruptcy and the MLR now holds all the rights. I think the Arrows Academy only still exists because it was already a partnership with Rugby Ontario. So those rights remain with Rugby Ontario at the moment. Oh, I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me on that. But like, even though Bill's gone, and even though the Arrows as a senior MLR team is gone, his legacy still remains. And I think that's super important.
I remember messaging him. I messaged him right before the World Cup too. I think it was a month or two. And I was like, oh, I wonder if he's going to go. And I'll have a drink with him or something like that. He's like, he's probably going. He's an owner of a team. He's probably got money. He's good going. I asked him. I messaged. I was like, hey, are you going to the Rugby World Cup? And he's like, oh, not this year. Not going to make it this year. And that's all he messaged me. And I was like, oh, sucks. I was going to buy you a beer. And he's like, next time. But then I think he died like a month later.
Yeah.
So I don't know how sick he was or anything, but yeah, he was a trailblazer, probably the most impactful person in Canadian rugby, in my eyes. Like, when you think of someone that's done, like, who is like done, like, who in Canada has like brought rugby to the forefront as much as he has, but like with the Arrows, like bringing a professional team and stuff like that. Like, that was huge. Especially having like a professional team to cheer for.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is sad. But when the Arrows folded, like what was the conversations with the Rouge Rugby? Like, what were you guys like because that must have been pretty impactful, because that was the majority of your content at one point.
Yeah. So we had already planned, I think, because the news came out in like the end of November, and we had already planned, like, look, Christmas is coming up. Nothing really happened in December anyway, which was obviously the commentator's curse. Was like, okay, we're going to take December off. We're going to plan ahead for 2024. We'll go from there. We'll do what the same thing we've done last season of, we'll follow MLR, we'll follow the Arrows. We'll speak of any, senior test games for both the men's and women's. We'll talk about sevens when those are happening, because that all changed as well. So when first of all, the announcement came, I believe, from like an Instagram page, first of all, which threw everyone off, because everyone's like, is this real? Is it?
I remember that first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
There was big drama.
And then as the day went on and we were looking for like more sources of information, reports came through from trusted websites. And then finally the Arrows and MLR put out a press release saying that the team would not be competing next year. And now, I know that people were like, oh, it only says like next year, maybe they'll come back in 2025. I knew immediately, like, no, the team's not coming back. This is it. Like, and that's just because other MLR teams have put that out, like the Austin Gilgronis or the LA Giltinis. They had put something out like that. And it's like, well, they're not here anymore. So no word on them either. So, and then obviously like a week later, New York folded as well for different circumstances.
It seemed pretty dire at one point, because it was like Arrows, then New York was going, and then I think Atlanta after that.
Atlanta was a pre-planned situation. So similar to Toronto, their owner, their financial backer, Marcus Callaway, he had passed away in late December of 2021. And I think the reason why Atlanta was able to continue where Toronto wasn't was because the earnings call and making sure the finances for the next season had already taken place by the time Callaway had passed. So Atlanta was already had the finances in place for the season, but because and Bill passed away in like late August, it was, before the earnings call, and from what I've gathered, it was a situation where they had a potential backer in place, but nothing the ink hadn't dried. They hadn't signed any contracts and stuff. And then when it came closer to the time, they got cold feet, pulled out, fully within their right to do. And then it was just like a struggle to try and find another backer in such a short period of time. And as such, the Arrows could no longer continue. So yeah, it's a bad situation, but it is what it is.
Yeah. So back to the podcast. So when now that happened, then so your guys were just like coming up with a new game plan for the lack of the Arrows.
Yeah.
Did you just so you guys have been covering MLR?
Yeah.
Yeah. Still?
So not as much anymore. We made the decision of during the regular season we would at most do an episode every 2 weeks. With the exception of if we had an interview on, and then the interviewer could be in between. We also kept our nose to the grindstone of any development at things like age grade level. So, for example, the men's under 20s, they're in a training camp at the moment for the Junior World Trophy, and that'll be taking place at the start of next month. I actually think probably from this coming weekend, because we're recording on the 27th of May, and I think the first game is June 1st. So,
you're talking about the Arrows Academy? Is that what you're talking about?
No, the national men's under 20s.
National, okay.
So,
because how often are the Arrows Academy playing now?
So the Arrows Academy, they are in what is known as the East Coast Rugby Championship. It's a new competition that's been established. And I think the big issue is that because rugby, they've been playing against Rugby Quebec, they've played against the New England Independents. It's all guys that are like either at club or in university, and so they're not it's not a professional environment, while some guys at New England and I think Quebec are doing like rugby on like a semi-pro level. So it's but we had head coach Jamie Cudmore and team manager Tim Matthews on a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying like, look, the focus on this is just making sure the guys are ready for the Coast to Coast Cup, which is happening next month as well. And so it's not necessarily about winning the games at the moment. It's making sure that things like technique can be addressed. And like I said, this is the first of a new competition. The finals, I think, take place this coming weekend as well. And they have, I believe, like an Ontario East versus West exhibition game coming up. So, and it'll be decided after that which players are then going to Halifax for the Coast to Coast Cup.
Did they talk about their end game for the Arrows Academy, like what their main objective is?
I think that what they were talking about is getting guys more experience in a high performance environment. I think there's also the realization as well of like saying, despite saying like, oh, I want, a professional rugby team in Ontario and I want a professional rugby team in Quebec and stuff like that. Sheer geography is like the big hindrance for that, both in Canada and the United States. And as a result, it's better to have these smaller competitions nearer to everyone where you have to take, you can take a coach to a location to play an opponent instead of flying here, there, or everywhere to play oppositions week after week.
Mm-hmm. Do you know where the funding is coming from for the Arrows Academy? Do you know how they're being
I think
floated
that's
there?
funded through Rugby Ontario, so through their partners, through their sponsors.
Because there has to be something coming from somewhere to have Cudmore still there.
Yeah, so I think that funding. So again, because the Arrow Senior Academy was always part of Rugby Ontario, so that's where the funding source was in place, regardless of whether the team would have been in MLR or not. So in the same way that, Rugby Quebec has their funding as well, and the Atlantic Privateers have their source of funding, and same with like Rugby Nova Scotia and the other participants of the East Coast Championship. As a result, their technical season is very short. It is, I think, only like April till June. So it's fully understood that these guys could then be in a position to, work in the summer, and then when they come back, they can play for their clubs where need be. And then as you get to winter, it's obviously a bit different. And then, so because the season's so short, I think like the funding is in place that it can allow for these guys. Again, I don't know the full financial breakdown, so I'm not an expert in this situation.
I was expecting you to. I'm a little let down.
No, I'm sorry.
Have you heard any rumblings, since you're like so connected with the MLR, like of any new Canadian expansion teams or anything? Any rumors?
There's always a rumor of a team's going to Vancouver, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. I think the smart approach for Rugby Canada and the provincial unions at this point is to focus on local rather than national. And because in the Rugby Canada strategic plan from 24 through to 29, the idea is to have 4 high performance bases by 2025 and up to 8 by 2029. But the reason why they chose those years is because I believe the focus is moving to women's rugby. And that's merely because World Rugby is now investing so much in the women's game that you'd be an idiot not to take advantage of what's being offered. So you can have like high performance facilities in Quebec, in Ontario, in British Columbia. Well, they've already got one in British Columbia. That is where Rugby Canada is based. But you can have one in Halifax, for example, where the Atlantic Privateers are. And then you can talk about, okay, if you got this high performance facility, what is the opportunity that, for the women, there's the Pacific 4 series. There's also the WXV. There's, in this time frame, there's going to be 2 Women's World Cups. So you can say, okay, this time, this is when those facilities are booked. For like non-traveling reserves, they can be based at whichever location is convenient to them. And if they need to be called up, they can then book a flight to fly to England, Australia for that tournament. But outside of that, when it's, a men's competition's coming up, like the Pacific Nations Cup, or hopefully the Men's World Cup, when that is in Australia, and hopefully Canada will be competing in that, and then we can block time and say, okay, like the men need this for their prep work, and then we can balance something out. Now, again, this is a conversation further down the line. These performance facilities haven't even been mentioned beyond that strategic plan. But then again, that only came out like a few months ago, so I'm not expecting, ground to be broken anytime soon. I'd say working in partnership with university facilities is probably like the best way to go for now. But it's one that like this forward planning needs to be done soon. And again, the focus is going to be women's rugby. But if you have then these high performance facilities, could you then have teams attached to those high performance facilities as well? So maybe it could be a situation in which, I don't know, Rugby Ontario have their team, whether that's the Arrows or a different enterprise entirely. And then you have Rugby Quebec, and then you have more games in a professional environment. And then you could build something like the Canadian Rugby Championship, which was put in place specifically so the national team could decide on who would be able to go to the Rugby World Cup based on, playing against other Canadians. Now, I'm not saying like that's the end goal. I fully understand like that would be, again, something that's very short, and because of distance travel, that would be a very expensive venture as well. So there would need to be funding models in place. But if it's something that can be pulled off, and it's something that means you don't have to fly all the way to Vancouver Island to be able to play for a national team, I think it's something that needs to be understood and realized as soon as possible.
Because their timelines in that announcement were surprisingly like quick. Like they wanted to reach a lot of goals like very fast.
I'll be honest, I prefer them being ambitious and conservative. I would rather them fail trying to get to like reaching the stars than accept reaching the hilltop.
Oh, I totally agree. At least, just trying to take all their shots as much as they can. How do you think they're doing so far on that plan?
So when the high performance review came out, it was basically like all the issues that everyone already knew about, just put into black and white. So, so I think one of the things that has hindered Rugby Canada as a whole is basically the refusal to accept that rugby is professional. And now you can argue that, okay, Rugby Canada didn't have the finances at the time to follow a professional model, and it had a lot of negative impact. Like so many clubs in England alone were no longer able to keep players because they just couldn't afford to pay them anymore. So I understand like that argument, but at the same time, by the time 2015 had come around, rugby had been professional for 20 years. And that was the last time Canada was really competitive at the Men's World Cup. So, like you look at 2019, they had to go through the repechage. The team that they came so close to beating in 2015, Italy, blew past them in 2019. And so I'd say that Canada has been in basically like digging its own hole for like 25 years. So any changes that are going to be made, especially in regards to men's rugby, that's going to take some time for things to come about. Now, I know the goal is for the men to qualify for the 2027 World Cup, and they have more opportunities for the qualification structure than they did last time out. Yeah. That was because of COVID. So make of that what you will. So what I think is that with women's rugby is that women's rugby, I'd say, really went professional around 2017. So just after the World Cup held in Ireland, I think England were like, hang on, we've got a bit of money kicking around. Let's put these women on professional contracts and see how they do. And, England have remained, they have been fantastic. Like, they lost the World Cup final and they were still number one in the world. That is how strong they had been. And then, of course, like New Zealand were like, oh, okay, we're going to put some money in because, we don't like losing to England and we don't want to lose to them in the World Cup. So let's put some money in now. And France followed same. Australia is also doing so with, I think it's like Super Rugby W. And so...
You have the Celts.
Yeah.
The Celtic Challenge too now.
Yeah. Yeah. Wales had made it to WXV1 last year. They weren't as successful this time around. But the caution I have is like, this seems to be following a very similar pattern to what we've seen with the men's team. Now, fortunately, a lot of Canadian players have been able to play in France or in England with the Premiership Women's Rugby, for example. But even now, there's conversations about that of like limiting the number of foreign players for teams there. Now, obviously, teams like Exeter and Saracens have been like kicking up a fuss because a lot of their best players, like Sophie de Goody, aren't English. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh yeah, well, we could keep Sophie de Goody, we can keep this player, we can keep that player, but we can't keep all these good players that we have. And if that happens, and in all fairness, the RFU is perfectly within their rights to say, we're going to limit players, especially if England stops being competitive on the global stage, then where the Canadian players going to go?
I was just talking about this exact thing you're talking about the other day. I was saying this open door that the Canadian women have is going to start closing soon to make way for the wave of women players in the countries where they have the professional rugby going.
Yeah.
So I was worried. That the Canadian women will start getting left behind because there'll be less spots for them to take in those professional teams because of rules like that. Especially when there's more development too, like in the lower divisions of women's rugby in like England and stuff like that, like a lot, because now that there's a professional league, there's going to be more money like trickling down. There's going to be a lot more high profile players coming up. Yeah. And like women playing like community rugby, because right now, like the women are playing like in like community rugby teams in Canada and making professional teams.
Yeah.
Like around the world. Right. But that door is going to start closing. So like Rugby Canada is kind of like in a race right now to make sure that the women can keep up, right? To keep developing that talent. Because like now we're riding on a high, like the Canadian women beating the Black Ferns. Like, I don't think a lot of people understand how significant of a sporting accomplishment that is.
Yeah.
Like, especially in New Zealand to take that.
Yeah, no. Oh, we talked about that a lot on our latest episode.
Oh yeah, I just listened to it actually.
That's the concern for me is like things are working out now, but all it takes is for the RFU or the French Union, or even if players get to play in like New Zealand, they just needs someone to make the decision of like, oh, you can only have 2 or 3 foreign players per team. And then you can have obviously players of dual nationality. Like, for example, I have a Canadian passport, I have a British passport. And if, I had a daughter who wanted to play rugby in England and play, with Saracens or Loughborough or any of those teams, she would be able to do so. But if she wants to make a commitment to Canada, then she has to either prove that she's one of the players that any of those teams make the exception for, or she has to leave the team. And, this has been happening in like men's rugby, and I fear that it will eventually happen in women's rugby, because all I can imagine is that, oh, Canada beat England in the semi-finals. Now we got to make a policy change. And so it basically become like the victim of your own success at that point. And so that's what I know that the United States is launching a women's professional rugby competition. However, at this time, there's not been that many details coming out about it. And again, it's the United States. Well, again, there aren't that many details at this point. But what I would suggest, based on the information we have already, like a national competition may not be the easiest thing to do, especially with regards to travel. I'd say if we could centralize a elite domestic competition or cross-border competition with the United States and have it based on the East Coast, the most populated area. You can then have teams from Ontario, teams from Quebec, teams from New England, teams from New York and stuff. And they don't have to be in the middle of, super expensive cities and stuff, but they just need to have grounds that can be played at. And if they can have a level of domestic competition, again, it doesn't need to run, all year. It just needs to run in like the springtime. And, if we can keep the travel distance to the minimum for the time being, and then, if the money comes, if the sponsorship comes, and then we can look at like expanding further out. But something needs to be in place because this safety net that the other unions are providing at the moment, that can disappear. And
no, exactly.
We're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, we don't want to see the same thing with the men went through too, because you're like talking like in 2015, like we're like extremely competitive against big teams, and then we get to 2019, and then and now, like it's a completely different story. Like just in like under 10 years, just like almost like a really like a complete collapse, like a ghost almost of what they used to be, which is really sad. What's your idea? What's your thoughts before we wrap up here? Like on an anthem type situation, like how was it Rugby USA putting in the anthem team? Like what's your thoughts on like a team like that for the men?
First of all, I think that this year is not the example to look at. I think because of the departure of New York and Toronto, having a 12th team really benefited. But because it was so last minute, the dispersal draft were basically third or fourth choices from other teams coming over and stuff. And then you obviously have the foreign players. Obviously, it's much reduced. So I can see Anthem probably being a lot stronger next season when they've had an entire off season to build towards it. I think they basically only had like 4 to 6 weeks to get this team off the ground. But I think as well, the idea is we can't put all our eggs into the MLR basket as well. I think that, we can have certain men's players go and play overseas. I think getting overseas knowledge and coaching is going to be incredibly beneficial. Anything as close to year-round training would be, fantastic for these younger guys. And as much as I want to say, there is no like easy answer for this. There is, I would say that having something is better than having nothing. So if there was like like Maple Leafs Academy that would play in MLR, I'd say absolutely, sure, we can have it based in BC, whether that's at the like Starlight Stadium or elsewhere, just for the sake of like travel ease and stuff like that. But again, it's, you're probably going to need the funding from World Rugby to help support it as well. And my only concern is, come the 2031 Men's World Cup, once that's done, does Anthem still continue? Does it get bought out by someone else, or does it just get does it cease to exist now that its purposes have been completed? Obviously, these are questions for someone else to answer. So, yeah, I'd say, like I say, something's better than nothing, but we need to have like proper planning and not just 4 weeks. Here's our third choice scrum half. You can go play instead.
Yeah, like my personal opinion, whatever it's worth, is I always think that like Rugby Canada should be trying to use more resources, getting players in professional setups in countries where they have the infrastructure and the professional setups, like in Europe or in Australia, New Zealand, like trying to get these players. I don't know how exactly you would do that, but like, yeah, just getting these players over there to get that experience, because we lack that infrastructure and that talent. That's what I personally think they should start doing. But you can go on with a plethora of things of what they should do. I don't think anyone really has the answers. Well, Stu, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
Yeah. That was some good conversation we had. I got a little nervous at the beginning. I kind of like went blank there right when we started. I was like, oh shoot, what was I gonna say? Fuck. But where can people find you? Where can people find the Rouge Rugby Podcast?
You can find our podcast on our website, therougerugby.ca. We're also available on Spotify, S4P, and Apple Podcasts. We have a YouTube channel at the Rouge Rugby, so make sure to like and subscribe, hit the bell notification. We're also available across social media, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Threads, all at the Rouge Rugby. But if you want to find me personally, you can find me at Hardman, spelled H4RDMAN.
All right, what's Twitter? I don't know what that is. I'm just kidding.
FKA.
Well, thank you.
Subscribe to X. No. And
you had that when I asked you where we could find. You had that saying down, Pat. Like you went through that.
I've done it so many times. It's there in the back pocket, ready to come out.
Well, friends, if you have any questions for us, the wish.com of the Rouge Rugby Podcast, you can email us at the friends of rugby pod at gmail.com. All right. Thanks again, Stu.
Thanks again. Much appreciated.